This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen. Healthcare is a right, not a privilege. And free doesn't just mean no charge. It's a state of mind. If you'd been one of the tens of thousands of young people who upped sticks and headed west in America in 1967, San Francisco, and in particular to the Haight Ashbury hippie countercultural revolution, you might have found that some of the locals did not welcome you. The city officials at the time thought that providing services, and in particular something like a health clinic in the Haight Ashbury, would only encourage people to stay. But fortunately for those in need of help and health, there was a refuge, the Haight Ashbury Free Clinic, a place where shivering hippies could be seen to be lining up and down the street. The clinic treated 250 of them on its first day, 350 on the second day. Some of them had injuries, gastrointestinal disorders, not to mention suffering dark hallucinations and bad trips. Here they would find help and medicine. We're going to hear more about the clinic and about its founder, my guest, Dr. David Smith, in this episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture. If you haven't joined us before, welcome back. If you have, check out all that we do at bureauoflostculture.com. You can lend us your support, contribute to our quixotic countercultural efforts, or just write us a letter. It's always great to hear from friends. Now back to today. I spent an enlightening, educational, inspiring couple of hours with an 85-year-old Dr. Dave, still doing the work on the Haight Ashbury. We talked about the 60s, of course. We talked about him growing up. We talked about the free clinic, Charles Manson, the CIA, drugs, about having a vision, about really living the countercultural life. Dr. Dave, how would you like to be addressed? Dave, David, Dr. Dave, Dr. Smith?
David's fine, Dr. Dave. Those are the two things they call me. Well, I'm in the Haight Ashbury district of San Francisco. I've lived on Frederick Street for 60 years. And I'm just 2 blocks from the original site of the Haight Ashbury Free Clinic is 558 Clayton Street. And 2 blocks up is the old Grateful Dead house, 710 Ashbury. And then 2 blocks down is my office at 850 16th. So this is my little world in the Haight Ashbury. I've lived here a long time.
Let me just tell you a little bit about this show. So it's devoted to counterculture, mainly British counterculture. But as you know, the British counterculture and the American counterculture were completely intertwined. And a lot of what we did here came from America, came from the West Coast.
Correct.
So I thought we could just start off by you telling us where it all began. Where did you grow up and what was that like?
I was born in 1939. This was at the end of the Great Depression in the United States. And my grandparents and my mother were born in Oklahoma. So you had the great Oklahoma migration to the West Coast during the Depression. Things were very bad in the United States. And initially they were farm workers in the field. They call it following the fruit. They worked overtime so my mother could go to nursing school. And it was very influential on me. My mother had 2 sisters, and the boss would come up and say, what can you do? And my grandmother would say, we'll do anything. And my mother said, never say you'll do anything. Say you're something. So she was the big force in me, getting an education. And I ended up going to UC Berkeley, UC San Francisco, and medical school. So that always stuck with me. And being an outsider, trying to be something.
Why were you an outsider?
Well, my parents died early. My mother died in 56. My dad died in 59. My peers at that time had mothers. I didn't. And I felt like an outsider. And I used accomplishment to make up for it. And so, for example, I was very involved in sports, but I was not the best athlete. But I would practice
When you went to Berkeley, which was in the late 1950s, right? First of all, you're studying zoology, right?
Correct.
Why Berkeley? And then why did you make this change into medicine?
I was a good student, good science student. And Berkeley in the 50s was the peak of academia in the state of California. If you were a top student and you wanted to go to the top, you went to Berkeley. That's what happened. The whole 50s, 60s protest was not a reason I went to Berkeley. Did you ever see the movie American Graffiti?
Yeah.
That's what Bakersfield was like. It was a car culture. In the summertime, I worked in the fields also. That's what you did. That was the job you had. I worked in order to have money to buy a car and to date girls. But I worked side by side by Mexican immigrants. We call them wetbacks then. So I was surrounded by discrimination, but I never related to it. It's just the way it was. And so I had this car, this 47 maroon Chevy that moon hubcaps and chrome pipes. And I just thought it was the coolest car on the face of the earth. And I drove up to Berkeley and I was going down University Avenue and nobody had a car like that. I felt like I had gone from Mars to Venus. The Berkeley culture was so different than the culture I was raised in. So I kind of felt like an outsider right from the beginning. But my goal was to succeed in that culture.
But already by then, North Beach and Berkeley and, these places in California were getting a reputation with the beats.
Right.
So when you went there, it was like this was a new world for you, was it?
Right. So if you entered into that world, you were exposed to it. But it wasn't the reason I went. But when you're there, you would go down to the North Beach and listen to the jazz. And then they had these readings by Allen Ginsberg. It was in the culture, but I experienced it, but it didn't identify with it. And they started cranking things up. It's hard to vision the times because UC Berkeley was very high academic. But under the surface was this progressive political movement. And I recall the House Un-American Activities. I was in a zoology experiment on how mice interacted in groups. And my PA said, "Are you going to the House Un-American Activities protest?" I said, "No, I need to get a good grade in this class." And he says, "You won't get a good grade unless you go." So I went.
That's progressive, right?
Yeah. I didn't have any idea what was happening.
Yeah, and just for anybody who doesn't know, this was the actual drive to push out any communist thinking or ideas, right, from American academia and
right.
Politics and society, right?
Right.
So these protests were organized by people at Berkeley, right, against this whole movement, right?
Kind of this progressive underground of students. It was kind of like there was this tidal wave coming along and you were sitting on banks fishing and then suddenly you got swept into the tidal wave and your only goal was to catch a fish. I was exposed to it, but I did not identify with it. It's just the way it was, and then there was the music and the art, and then Joan Baez sang, and you'd go very rich cultural, political narrative that you were exposed to.
And why do you think that it started to draw so many young people to San Francisco, to the West Coast? What was it? What was it that felt so important for them that they would, travel across the country, give up maybe opportunities or jobs or education to come there?
Question as to why that happened, in part, is geographic. The Haight Ashbury district of San Francisco borders Golden Gate Park.
Right.
San Francisco was the beginnings of the American labor movement in the 30s with the longshoremen. And so the old leftists moved to the Haight Ashbury. It's a working class neighborhood because the rents were cheap. Remember, San Francisco is viewed as liberal now. It wasn't then. It was run by conservative Irish Catholics. And they made a decision that they were going to destroy the Panhandle by putting a freeway through it.
The Panhandle's a park, right?
Yeah, it runs right through the Haight Ashbury. It was one of the first urban protests of this era to block the freeway. So suddenly in the Haight Ashbury was this political movement. The 1906 fire, the Golden Gate Park blocked it. And so some of the best Victorian stock is in the Haight Ashbury. Our house, for example, we are in, is an old Victorian built in 1898. So the Haight Ashbury is these big old Victorians that had been allowed to decline. So then the rock bands moved in. That's why the Grateful Dead were with Ken Kesey taking LSD down in La Honda, and they're developing their psychedelic music. Parallel to that, another piece of history was that the CIA was using LSD for mind control experiments. UC Med Center, where the Department of Pharmacology was studying it. Then there was Alan Watts and others that were doing it for kind of spiritual reasons. In other words, 3 overlapping loops.
Tell us a little bit more about that. The CIA was seeing these drugs has some potential, either weaponizing them in some way or using them in some way of control.
Yeah, this was the Cold War, and this was the anti-communist era. And then there was this belief that the Chinese and Korea and Russia had mind control drugs. And so the U.S. started the experiments. And some of the famous ones were that they sprayed LSD into volunteers to see what would happen. And they called them non-lethal incapacitating agents. They did that they would spray LSD on foreign troops and disorganize them. And then they had just a short distance from here on Pine Street, what they did was that Operation Midnight Climax. They had prostitutes recruit Johns from North Beach, slip LSD into their drink, and then the CIA agents would observe what happened through the one-way mirrors. And so they realized that these could be used as incapacitating agents. That was the thing. A troop under LSD is not a good fighter. Goes exactly the opposite. And then they were deciding, about what they were saying, whether they can control their mind and implant memories. There's all sorts of stuff like that. But the most significant part relative to the counterculture, that Ken Kesey, a famous author, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, volunteered was an LSD experiment. He did not know it was backed by the CIA. He took LSD and had a transformative experience, and then it totally changed his perception of life. There's some debate in history as to whether that exposed him to the whole concept of mental illness wasn't a factor in him writing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. There was that type of thing and so then he went on to start to marry pranksters.
Right.
And he wrote an article called The Revolt of the Guinea Pigs. In other words, the CIA did not give him LSD in order to start the countercultural revolution. It was just the opposite. They were hoping to understand it. But then you started seeing Timothy Leary from the East Coast turn on, tune in, drop out. Then the whole countercultural revolution spread to the West Coast and centered in the Haight Ashbury district of San Francisco.
So all these coinciding factors made the Haight and San Francisco this kind of magnet for young people.
Right.
You mentioned about this whole CIA thing. Did they ever try and get you involved in that? And were you aware of it at the time, or was this something that you became aware of later?
Well, that's a debate in history. I can give you what the debate is. I founded the Haight Ashbury Free Clinics in June of 1967. That's when addiction was a crime. Doctors that treated addiction were guilty in aiding and abetting a felony. It was a response to the thousands of people that came to the Haight Ashbury, and the law enforcement said, well, if you're crazy enough to work there, you can do it, but you can't go outside of it. So they basically walled off the Haight Ashbury district of San Francisco. And if you stayed in there, nothing would happen to you. Then, they would arrest people, but they let the doctors work. He said, I don't know what he's doing, but he's from a big university, so it must be okay. And they would send in undercover agents when we set up a detox, and undercover agents would come out and say they're trying to get them off of drugs rather than put them on drugs. And then they would have DEA taking our pictures as we walked out. I found out my picture was all over the wall. Head of the local narcotics bureau, Matt O'Connor, said, they're dealing drugs in your waiting room. If you don't stop it, we're going to have to close you. So we had this interaction with law enforcement because everybody knew each other. Our clinic was funded by rock and roll concerts. Bill Graham, Lou Adler, Monterey Pops Festival, the local bands, Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Carlos Santana, did these benefits for us. And the clinic was all volunteer then, So we were operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Well, theory in some of these books was that it was all backed by the CIA, which is not true. I mean, I have the original donation checks. Now, it was a project by Jolly West that studied the youth taking psychedelics. And there's the claim that government funded, and that was backed by the CIA. At that time, because there was so much misinformation, that I started the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs to give objective, multidisciplinary information because I was doing research on psychedelics up at UCSF. That journal was the information source that anybody could use. And there's the claim that CIA used it. It was open source, so lots of people used it. I heard these rumors, but I knew they weren't true. Well, now people are coming along and say, well, there was truth to it. But I know there wasn't truth that the CIA backed the clinic. In fact, it doesn't make sense why would one branch of government try to arrest us and another branch of government support us? I guess you could say the DEA and the CIA didn't communicate, but I can verify that there was no funding.
Was it more that they were covertly using you in your work to be able to observe people who were using drugs?
I think that is a more valid theory, because we published it all. We had conferences, we presented it about the pharmacology of LSD, how it acts. But a whole other chapter in that was that Charlie Manson came to our clinic. His probation officer was Roger Smith. I met him at UC Berkeley and when I taught at the Department of Criminology. And then that was when the hate started turning bad. And we got a grant from Amphetamine Project. And that was when the conspiracy theorists activated. Why did we get this grant? Well, we got it because we were the ones that were on the front lines treating methamphetamine addiction, and he was the head of it.
Was Charles Manson and his family coming to the clinic?
Yes.
Do you remember them?
Yeah, it's called Competing Gurus. It was so weird then that I couldn't have picked him out. Some of our staff interacted with him, and he would use LSD to perform magic trips, and that's how he kind of gained control over these girls. And so it was kind of a naturalistic observation on how in the counterculture, these gurus would take LSD, manipulate the thinking of these vulnerable young women and direct their activities. And of course, that all became part of the infamous murder that came up. But prior to that, we wrote a study because when the hippies left the Haight, they went to communes. We categorized different types of communes. We had this, what we called a commune health project that studied the communes. We found that they had a particular type of commune, group marriage. Everybody had sex with everybody. Charlie was the head. He would use psychedelics to recruit males into it to do his bidding.
Here is a sidebar about MK Ultra and some of the rumours that Dr. Dave referred to. In his 2019 book, Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA and the Secret History of the 60s, author Tom O'Neill, a previous guest on this show, had suggested various connections between the Haight Ashbury Free Clinic, Charles Manson and some of Dr. Dave's collaborators. Decades after Manson and his murderous cult had made their mark on American culture, evidence emerged suggesting that a secret CIA program may have contributed to Manson's rise to infamy. MKUltra, the mind control research program that began in the 50s, used numerous methods to manipulate subjects' mental states, such as covert administration of psychoactive drugs without the subject's consent, electroshocks, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and other forms of torture. Operation Midnight Climax, a sub-project of MKUltra. As Dr. Dave mentioned, prostitutes on the CIA payroll were instructed to lure clients back to safe houses where they were surreptitiously piled with a wide range of substances, including LSD, monitored behind one-way glass. The prostitutes were instructed in the use of post-coital questioning to investigate whether the victims could be convinced to involuntarily reveal secrets. So victims were sometimes fed subliminal messages in attempts to induce them to involuntary actions, including criminal activity. Many of the CIA operatives voluntarily indulged in the drugs and prostitutes for recreational purposes. Surprise, surprise. Meanwhile, in 1967, Manson, by then 32-year-old, had spent half his life in prison for myriad crimes. His parole officer, Roger Smith, was part of a federally funded program researching LSD and drug use amongst San Francisco's population. Roger's tenure at the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic allowed him to collaborate with Dr. Dave. The clinic's doctors and clinicians began to recognise the frequent presence of young runaways and addicts who belonged to Manson's cult. An assistant researcher named Alan Rose took the initiative to visit the Manson family's Los Angeles compound. After 4 months of immersive research took his time, Rose returned to San Francisco. In 1970, he and David Smith co-authored the first scholarly study of the Manson family called The Group Marriage Commune, a case study. Roger Smith's position as a parole officer allowed him to provide an element of immunity to his research subjects. Although he had had the power to send Manson back to prison for violating the terms of his parole, Smith never reported the cult leader's numerous infractions. Manson remained free, and dark countercultural history was made.
We published that article before the violence, but it was a kind of a study on how cult violence occurs.
So you did a formal study of commune life focusing on what Manson was doing,
right,
as a research project.
That is correct, yeah. We studied different types of communes. So this was before the violence.
Did you go and visit the Manson commune?
One of our staff people did. That's how I found out about it.
I was just wanting to go back a little bit and fill in a few gaps with your life, because you were at Berkeley and you were studying first zoology, then you transferred to medicine. You did some experiments yourself with rats and LSD.
I was looking at different drugs and different animal studies and determine how differently the drugs acted. The animals acted. For example, you inject methamphetamine in a rat or a mouse. They get very violent. You give a mouse high enough doses of methamphetamine, it has a seizure, it dies. It's called medium dose lethal. You put them in a group, and not only does the dosage required to produce death lower, the mechanism of death changes. In other words, the normal grooming behavior turns into a violent interaction, and they die of the wounds affected from the fights. But if you give a mouse LSD, they get confused, but there's no violent interaction. It kind of disrupts their normal grooming behavior, but they don't get violent. They just get spacey. That's kind of the studies that we were doing, is that how different drugs act in animal models relative to aggregate interaction. And then Dr. Gene Schoenfeld brought over ibogaine. So we did early studies with ibogaine, a variety of other psychedelics. But about that time is when I first took LSD myself, and it was a transformative experience. At the beginning, it was purely academic.
Can you set the scene for us? Tell us how that came about, why you decided to do it, where you did it, what dose you took, and what happened.
So to go into the history, all this was bubbling right around me. And then they had this song, "Come to San Francisco with Flowers in Your Hair." And these kids started arriving and showing up at San Francisco General, and they had the Human Being. That was at Golden Gate Park, just a short walking distance from where I live. So that was interesting. And I went over there not to participate, but to observe. And they had all what hippies, tribes, fascinating experience. And they were very much into hallucinogens and indigenous culture. All these groups. Well, I'd never seen anything like that. And then you had Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg, and the Grateful Dead was playing. And it was just totally new. Never seen anything like that, nor had anybody else in our world. For example, a fellow named Dean Chalice that I went to UC Berkeley, had gone to Vietnam War, and then he came over and he stayed with me. He walked down to the donut shop, and they got a donut over the counter or offered LSD under the counter. And I said, "What is this LSD?" He thought it was like, in the Navy, it was a landing craft. I mean, it was kind of like being projected to Mars if you lived in a different culture. You just couldn't believe what was happening. And in the Golden Gate Park and the Panhandle, the Grateful Dead were playing, and that's where a lot of those musicians developed their music. It was a whole different form of music. For example, the Grateful Dead played, it just began, went on and 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 on. There was no, in a sense, no ending. And then the girls would twirl, and they would see notes coming off Jerry Garcia's guitar, and they would see the sound in the air, and there would be the trees, and they'd talk to the trees, and it was an absolutely fascinating phenomenon.
At this point, you're an observer, right? You're watching.
I'm just an observer. It just, it was kind of like being in a movie, watching a scene. And then I decided, I studied LSD. I put it into mice, and they seemed to do okay. So I decided, I had access to the drug, and I measured it out, and I took what's considered a therapeutic dose of LSD, 150 micrograms. Just had a incredible transformative experience. Totally changed my view of the world. And I had this sense of everybody else that were also outsiders, and they were being harassed by the police, and they were arrested, and they were denying health care. It felt, as most people that have what we call it breaking through to the other side, transformative experience, that we're all part of the same universe. And
where were you at the time, and were you on your own?
I was with some people. There was this period of time, my parents had died, and I inherited some money, and I got this house in Tahoe, and I was an avid skier. But then this ski house where we would party had kind of a binge alcohol problem. And when I took LSD, I stopped drinking. I had this transformative experience, and I created what I call a sacred place up there. It's in nature. That's where I took it, by Lake Tahoe.
David, if you think back now, can you still connect with that experience?
Oh, yeah. Very vivid, because if you've experienced psychedelics, they open up your mind, you transform into this other world. I had this experience of seeing and actually talking to my deceased parents. I have some Native American background from Oklahoma. So I had an experience of intergenerational trauma. I mean, you actually saw sound. The amazing thing, but you actually felt the trees talking to each other. Mm-hmm. It sounds crazy unless you've actually experienced it. In other words, it was like a Van Gogh painting, and you would see light waves going from one tree to another. I'm sure there's lots of people have found that in different ways, but it makes sense to those that have had the psychedelic experience. So when I came back, there was this big conference at UCSF on the health of the Haight Ashbury. And the city wanted the hippies to go away. They didn't want to take care of them. The neighbors hated them. Law enforcement wanted to arrest them. And we had this group of volunteers out of UCSF. We called it our psychopharmacology study group. We were all studying psychedelics and had taken psychedelics. Uttered healthcare is a right, not a privilege.
Do you think this is the turning point for you, or the pivotal moment where you decide to harness or marshal your academic qualities and abilities for the benefit of young people who had come to San Francisco who were in need? Is this the moment, if you like, where you make that shift from being a young man who's, studying medicine, being a professional, to somebody who's immersed in this world and doing the work?
Yes. David Smith, before that, I had the skills and I had the studies, but my goal was professional and academic success. I then suddenly changed, took huge risks that, in fact, were counter to academic and financial success to start a free clinic. It was huge risk. For example, there was a lot of publicity there, and there was a big article on me, and my malpractice insurance carrier canceled the malpractice insurance. I didn't know you were treating those weirdos. And that's when the San Francisco Medical Society, its progressive, came to our aid. It was a huge conflict. In the summer, we had a lot of supporters and we had a lot of opposition, but I had totally changed my life goals.
June the 7th, 1967, you opened the clinic. I think you said on the first day, there was people lining up down the street, 250 people on the first day. On the second day, the words got out, 350. You talk about, those injuries from botched abortions, gastrointestinal disorders from eating bad food, bad trips from drugs, and people showing up with anxiety attack and all sorts of states. But you see this need, you change what your goals are, and your new goal is to help these people, right? And you run into a lot of professional disapprobation. So your colleagues are like, what the are you doing?
Right.
Your insurers cancel your insurance. The authorities are like, don't encourage them. It must have been really quite a challenging time.
That is correct. But I had this vision. I think there's also, they had these signs, hippies go home. And it recalled when in the 30s in Bakersfield, they would have Okies go home. So it got me a flavor of discrimination. I had kind of repressed discrimination. That's my background, and I wanted to rise above it. That's what happens when you take a psychedelic. It opens up your mind to repressed issues, and that all came out.
You're responding to the discrimination. I think you've also said, that at this time, these people were regarded as beyond the pale, therefore, providing medication for them shouldn't happen. You shouldn't give medicine to addicts. Addiction was seen as a criminal activity and a moral weakness, right, rather than an illness. If you treat people with addiction, you're sort of enabling bad behavior in some way.
Exactly. That was the prevailing theory to all problems of addiction. But in this particular area, they had these young people that had drug problems. They didn't like how they looked. They didn't like what they wore. They didn't like their music. What they really rejected was the fact that they said, make love, not war. They were not warriors. They were peace seekers that lived communally, a free love, sexual ethic that was very offensive to the dominant culture. And so you had a huge, giant culture clash. But there's a lot of alienated youth nationwide, including England. And I think that fits into your initial narrative.
But I mean, the extraordinary thing about the clinic which you set up is that it's still going, albeit under a different name, but it's still going. It's been going all that time. It also inspired other free clinics around the country, right? A whole movement in a way.
Right.
And I wanted to come back to this phrase which you've used, which is healthcare is a right, not a privilege.
Right.
Now, that seems like a deeply countercultural statement. You could even say that it's a civil rights statement.
That's what I believe. That was the founding motto of the Haight Ashbury Free Clinics. And we viewed ourselves as a kind of a civil rights protest against discrimination.
Freedom doesn't just mean no charge. It's a state of mind. And
Correct.
You were at the Free Clinic. It was also at the context of the diggers making everything free. I interviewed Peter Coyote, I'm sure you know. And this was at a time when it was counterculturally speaking or philosophically speaking, where freedom itself was more than just about money and paying for things, right?
Right. And I've shared this with Peter, that they had here in the Haight, the diggers. In fact, a short distance from our place was the old digger store. And I mean, they were a very powerful force here. They were different than we were. And then they tended to be more, anarchistic. I wasn't really wanting to change society. I was very focused on healthcare. And they wanted to have like barefoot doctors doing the medical care on the street. And I says, doctors don't do that. They're willing to practice, but they want equipment. They want a space. They're willing to volunteer. But, we'll have outreach teams. The concept of free came from the diggers. The philosophical concept of non-judgmental healthcare. And so basically we took that concept of free, non-judgmental, and translated it into a physical facility called the Haight Ashbury Free Clinic. And that's one of the reasons we got all these countercultural youth coming in.
This is a free medical clinic run by the hippies themselves to look after the kids on the street. We have several doctors who come in to take care of us and donate their time free.
Jan, you say recurrence of hepatitis?
Well, I'm not sure, but that's the way it seems to be.
This free medical clinic has to thrive because this is a place where you can put your ear to the ground. There are also a lot of ugliness coming into this clinic. There is real medicine being seen here. Friday is my day. I usually come up about 2 and I'll stay 5 or 6 hours. The first few nights I stayed late because there were a lot of things that I'd never seen. I do no counseling except, have you eaten today? Do you have a place to sleep? No moralizing.
Wake up now.
Hey, man. Hey, let me look at your throat.
Oh, the throat's fine.
There must be a special motive relating to a larger view of society to bring doctors already overworked to serve extra hours in this clinic. The clinic was created by the director of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Screening Unit of San Francisco General Hospital, Dr. David Smith. And we asked him about this.
Most of the people that volunteer for our clinic are either young people like myself who have some special interest in the area, or are older people that have teenage kids of their own. And we find that an individual's attitude towards, let them die, that's their bag, changes dramatically when their own child goes to the Haight Ashbury. And that many of our doctors, we've had a marvelous response from the medical community, and many of the doctors are older doctors that have teenage daughters, and they want to help, honestly want to help. But they also state that they want to learn more about what's making the young people in the Haight Ashbury run away from middle-class homes.
That was a time in which homosexuality was stigmatized, so they'd come in with rectal gonorrhea. They would come in with, drug problems. We would have even more mainstream people that had these stigmatized diseases would come to us because we were non-judgmental. And that was how we got so involved in the early gay culture, which really relates to the later AIDS epidemic.
Somebody could come to the clinic and there was no judgment. There was no judgment about how they taught the disease or why they were using drugs. And of course, over the years, the patients, as you said, shifted from being young hippies to all sorts of other people, right? People who were just, ordinary Joes, if you like, but had a serious drug problem, or you started to treat Vietnam veterans who were returning home as heroin addicts.
And that's why the vets came to our clinic, because they were being treated like garbage in society, coming back from Vietnam, called baby killers, and they came to our clinic for detox, and we treated them in a non-judgmental way for the problem, and didn't, it was kind of like we were a safe haven from all that was going on in society.
You've helped many, many people, and you've inspired other people to help many, many other people too. There's Rock Med, that you helped to set up, addresses people who've got medical issues and drug issues at the festivals. You published the journal of, it was psychedelic drugs, but now it's psychoact, all sorts of work and research. You've just kept going all these years, right? And fast forward and just talk a little bit about what's happening at the moment and also what the future is.
Yeah, I think the issues that we dealt with are still issues now. I still have this vision, established this goal. I'm 84, so obviously I'm slowing down, but the Haight Ashbury Clinic is now called Health Right 360. It's a large facility, but just down the street at the 558 Clayton Street, it's now run by the Homeless Youth Alliance, Mary Howe, and you walk by there Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and there's all the street people that are out there coming in, and they're needle exchange, detox, food. When you talk with these homeless people on the street, and they're young people, and they say, well, society treats us like garbage. And you come to the Homeless Youth Alliance and the Haight Ashbury Clinic, you get treated like human beings. And it's called therapeutic engagement. And if you have therapeutic engagement and you help them with the immediate problem, and you say, by the way, there is treatment. By the way, there is a healthier lifestyle. By the way, living on the street is trauma. Maybe you ought to try to this. Well, a certain percentage of them listen. I've had individuals that I know that are in recovery now say, I was on the street, I was arrested, but come to the clinic, they treat me like a human being, I listened to them, and that kind of changed my life. Some of them, I know the one that her father I played basketball with, and she started out middle class, and she ended on the street, heroin addict, arrested 12 times. So I think that society believes that these people all start that way. Addiction drives you down to the street. And you lose everything, but then they have the potential for rehab. So she, gets sick and tired. We put her on buprenorphine. She's stabilized. She goes out and she's clean and sober and just had a baby.
Wow.
So that's what keeps me going. The miracle of recovery.
That's amazing. You said physicians in America have often become business entrepreneurs rather than healers.
Right. That's a huge debate here in the United States.
So many people are now uninsured, and they fall. There's more and more people actually who are in need of these services, right?
Right. That's a big battle here in the United States. Is big corporations taking over, phasing out community clinics. Healthcare is a right, not a privilege. I never could have projected. It started with this hippie, but now it's translated, and it's the motto of the Democratic Party. The type of free clinics that are being formed now, many of them are church-based by retired physicians. They're not old hippies. The other thing that's exciting, and many of them are student-run. So many of the ones that are coming out of the med schools that are student-run, and of course that's our future, is to have med students that believe in the principles, see what's happening. I know some of these younger ones are going into addiction medicine because they see so much alcoholism and addiction. So there's definitely hope for the future, but it is It's going to be to inspire the next generation of young people.
There's lots of reasons why people take drugs, of course. The story of psychedelic drugs and the counterculture, it's a mixed one, right? Because so much good came out of it, didn't it? And so much damage. It's a strange story, isn't it?
It is a very strange story. And what I'm hoping will happen, and we'll learn from our mistakes. Let's not think that, everybody should take it and it's going to solve all the problems of the world. I don't want those people to be arrested, but that's not my focus. My focus is there are all these studies now that show that psychedelic drugs can help with depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, refractory substance abuse disorders that have not responded to traditional methods. And the research is robust. For example, with the successful study with alcoholism found that psilocybin, given a couple of times, produced an enhancement of the spirituality index. And of course, the original AA was that alcoholism is a spiritual disease. The change in life is not just you stop drinking, but you open up and start helping others. I'm very involved in a 12-step program like Alcoholics Anonymous, and the ultimate of AA is helping others.
Do you think that beyond the therapeutic use, that psychedelics might still have a countercultural function in terms of raising consciousness from, let's call them, more selfish concerns to more selfless or communities concerns?
Oh, yeah, I believe it. I just want it to be done in a ceremonial context. In other words, all the value of psychedelics for spiritual enhancement should be done like the original indigenous cultures did. The indigenous cultures didn't just say, oh, God, just go take it. They did it in a ceremonial context. And what we're doing, we have this Haight Ashbury Psychedelic Center that if you're going to do it, this is the way to do it. Setting, know what you're doing it. Just don't do it for fun. To me, it's taking a psychedelic just for fun is almost sacrilegious. It's like, but I don't want people that are doing it that way to be arrested. We want to set the guidelines. And when we have the people that take psilocybin, we have preparation while you're doing it, integration after, and recognition that stuff will come up. For example, I had a really bad injury and I had some PTSD, a flashback. So I went back to my ceremonial place and with a guide, took psilocybin recently. Very powerful experience. The flashbacks disappeared, but in the course of the intense psilocybin experience, I went all the way back to my Native American culture. And the only time I cried was I had this vision of the white man destroying indigenous cultures. And that was totally not the reason I took it. When you take a psychedelic, you must recognize that stuff will come up that you had no idea would come up. In fact, that's the origin at Burning Man of a bad trip. People take it and dance around, and then suddenly all this stuff comes up. But they now have Burning Man they have called Zendo, which is really quite amazing, where they actually convert a bad trip into a good trip. They actually use the ceremony, talk down and translate it into a therapeutic experience. So there's so much fascinating stuff going on now.
Can I ask you about your own psychedelic use after that first experience with LSD? So did you carry on taking LSD, and have you've experimented over the years with different psychedelic substances?
I would try every one of them once, and I had that frame of reference. But also I have this history of alcoholism. I started smoking marijuana, and I became dependent on marijuana. And my wife has been in recovery from heroin for 46 years. And she said, you can't smoke marijuana and live in this house. I stopped drinking a long time ago, but I realized that I'd become dependent on marijuana and I couldn't stop. So I went in, that's when I went into AA, took the first step. And it's been a great thing. I feel the spirituality of AA and the spirituality of psychedelics are very similar, but the psychedelics are non-addicting. I happen to be the group that found that cannabis can produce dependence, and I was one of them. That's a big debate. Dependence is not the severity of withdrawal, but continued use in spite of adverse consequences. One of the scariest things about drug dependence is when you're highly motivated to stop and you can't. It's only been recently, for totally different reasons, that I've used the psilocybin. And that was not to see what it was like, but rather because I had, for the therapeutic use of it.
How did you find it after all these years?
Incredible. Therapeutic use, you have a specific reason why you do it. But it brought back all the same visions. And, the effects in the brain are you can have a specific reason why you did it. When I first did it in 1967 with LSD, it was like to see what it was like. When I did it basically 2 years ago, it was based on these studies that found out that you can deal with PTSD. And it did, but it opened up your mind to all this other stuff. You say taking psychedelics when you're young and when you're middle-aged and when you're a senior like I am, you will have very different types of experiences. One of the things they're doing at UCSF is death and dying. They're using psychedelics for death and dying, and you can, I can see it. You see the afterlife, and it decreases your fear of dying.
It could prepare you for that transition, right?
Transition to the other world. A lot of the interesting studies in indigenous cultures say that the early Christians use botanical hallucinogens, and that's how they helped create this concept of heaven and earth and the afterlife and heaven and hell. And now that obviously is speculation, but I can see how it would happen. How would you imagine this if you didn't do something that was mind-altering originally?
There are those biblical stories, aren't there, about where people have visions and dreams, precognitive dreams. You have to wonder whether that's actually connected with some psychoactive substance, right?
Well, that's the theory, and I can see it. I mean, how can you imagine in this afterlife and what's on the other side of the doors of perception unless you've done this? It's hard to describe.
What's next for you? You've got your autobiography is coming, right? And are you just going to keep working until it's time to transition?
Right, till I move on to the other side. Yeah, and I'm slowing down, but I interacting with the younger generation and preserving this message. When you get to be my age, and I always want to stay focused, I want to say, well, what have I learned that can help the next generation? I have 5 grandchildren. Obviously, I have all the issues of death and dying. I've had 7 friends, including one I'm very close to, pass this year.
When you walk down Haight Ashbury, every day when you're going to the store or going to post a letter, is it still vivid for you that 60 years ago, as a young man coming to this place and this crazy scene, that you were completely immersed in?
Oh, yeah. It's like it just happened yesterday. They had down at Ben & Jerry's, they had a benefit of it. And I went down there, and then I walked down Haight Street, and then I go down by the 710 Ashbury and where Janis Joplin lived. And then I go by the 558 Clayton Street, the site of the original Haight Ashbury Clinic. And out in front is all these people, young people gathered that are street people. And it's kind of like it's a movie set. I can remember the day the clinic opened probably better than I can remember what happened yesterday. But that's what happens when you get to be my age.
I suppose the emotion of it is so strong, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Do you dream of that time sometimes?
Yes. Yeah. And what really bothers me is how much optimism there was and how things went wrong. And I just pray that we can learn the good stuff, but not repeat the bad stuff.
Did you think at the time that you really could change the world? I'm fascinated by the idea that young people, genuinely believed that they could change everything. Was that a feeling was that a feeling that you shared?
Oh, yeah. Of course, we did make substantial impact, help creating the whole field of addiction medicine, but then reality sets in and you realize that everybody doesn't have the same vision that you do, and that evil exists. That's a
Do you
tough
feel
one.
optimistic about America or pessimistic?
I still have the belief, but I'm feeling very ambivalent and tilt to the negative. That's why I stay in the Haight Ashbury. I got my little world here, my little world of optimism. Donald Trump hasn't visited the Haight Ashbury, hasn't, what's happening in the United States is very troubling to me, and particularly when they attack the initiatives that we started. So my world has shrunk. And I got my little world here. It's still advancing the issues that we believe in. There's good in the world, but evil exists. And there's a lot of evil happening in the United States now.
Yeah, we live in difficult times, don't we? But David, you've helped a lot of people. You've helped a lot of people to help a lot of other people. You've inspired a huge amount of people, with the clinic itself, and that's, that whole movement has grown. You've been a big part of the change. You were the change.
Albert Einstein said, we're all just borrowed stardust. When we pass, we'll just return to the stardust, and your goal is to have what molecules of stardust that you contribute back to the universe are positive. So I just want to be positive stardust and contribute to society with what time I have left.
Dr. Dave, thank you so much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Well, thank you very much for the interview.
He has helped a lot of people. I should have said as well, eventually as drug addiction problems became more serious, the clinic also just began treating people's symptoms, even though it was illegal at the time for doctors to give control medication to addicts. His small office in Clayton Street helped launch the entire free clinic movement, which has expanded to over 1,200 clinics around the US. All builds upon Dr. Dave's principle of healthcare as a right, not a privilege. Thank you for spending your countercultural time with us here at the Bureau of Lost Culture. I will see you down the road, round the bend, and over the hillsides next time for more tales and oral testimonies from the underground, from the other side. Let's finish with a tune.